This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about how to practice your art as a writer. And I know, Kathryn, you brought this topic to us with Picasso on your mind. So.
I did. I brought the topic with artists in general on my mind, but Picasso was the one that came to my head. And we talked about this briefly. But it's just the idea that I think sometimes we think that when we sit down and we write that the finished product needs to be perfect art. And how do we as writers practice in a way that allows us to develop and to grow and to become better artists? You know, it's easy to see from a visual art perspective. You know, I went to art class today. I drew 3 still lifes. I had the assignment to go and sit in a park and draw everybody who passed by, you know, like all these different ways that we can think of automatically for visual artists to practice their art and become better. And so it made me wonder kind of what tools we have that maybe we don't utilize as much as we should. I don't know, to become better artists. I think in general, I just sit down at my latest project and go. Mm-hmm. And is that the best way to develop as a writer or not? There you go.
Oh no, what you're describing sounds like the ways I teach my students in workshops. You know, I assign them free writing exercises. We have prompts. We do things in class, and they have homework that they have to do. And besides practice writing that you know isn't necessarily going to end up anywhere, you know, that's just for the sake of practice. We're reading things and discussing things. And then so much of the writing practice that we do has a connection to what we've been reading and discussing. So I think in or out of a classroom or a workshop, reading, but not just reading to consume a story, but reading and then going back to it and saying, what's happening in this? You know, what is this author doing? What's of interest to me here, positive and negative? And then when you see something that sparks your creative mind, you know, whatever that is, turn it into a writing prompt. Practice, go play, go be playful, get your sketchbook, right? That's the Moleskine, the iconic Moleskine notebook that supposedly all of the writers in Paris in the 1920s were carrying around in their pockets.
Definitely. I think just to follow on from what you're saying, Alida, as well, that what has made a difference to me always has been having constraints. And so being forced to write something specific into a structure that I'm not necessarily familiar with. So taking, for example, you know, great stories that you've loved or even a scene from a movie, you know, and say, okay, I'm going to try and write something like that. And without it being perfect, just draft it, just make something. It's like, okay, I'll take not that character, but a different character with a different setting, but I'll follow that same structure. And it's quite eye-opening, I think, to be able to get down to that micro level of craft where you're looking at interactions on the page, which in my mind actually is probably one of the areas where a lot of authors can execute better. And part of the problem is it takes too long. You know, there's this classic thing about you've got to get your million words of rubbish out. But then if you're not getting any coaching or if you're not getting any editorial feedback, and especially in the self-publishing world where you're not submitting it into an editorial team, it's very hard to get feedback except from putting your product live and readers. Well, obviously that's one form of feedback. And commercially, that's fine. But let's say what you want to do is actually become more artistically proficient, so that, well, for really different reasons, because you want to elevate the art, because you want to practice more easily, because you want to reduce stress, because you got more stories, you want to get out faster, all sorts of different reasons. I think practicing with proper cohort feedback or expert feedback or mentor feedback to get very fast loops. So exactly what feedback loops, which is what Alida is saying, is, in a teaching environment, you give a variety of tasks because they apply creative constraints. And most of us hate creative constraints. We just want to write our stuff. But in actual fact, a creative constraint is probably the fastest way to get some really specific feedback about some very mechanistic elements of the craft, in my view, anyway. And it's different to sitting around talking about the developmental aspects of your plot and, where the character's angst is coming from. We're talking now about the practice of writing and improving. It's pointless doing, 120 charcoal sketches if by the end of it, you're just as frustrated as when you started because no one's been able to point you in the right direction.
Oh, absolutely. And, when I entered my MFA program, I had been working on a novel for a number of years. And I was sitting down and working on that novel and working on that novel and working on that novel. And then I get into the program and now I've got assignments, write this many pages or words for your short story, turn it in within 1 week. It's got to be this prompt or this form or this, whatever. And all of a sudden, instead of just sitting down and working on my novel, my creativity and my mental processing of story was going in 5 directions a week instead of just one. And every week it was 5 different directions instead of just one, week after week after week. And that was beyond valuable. Just it opened the floodgates on seeing what I could do by forcing myself to do new things all the time and with constraints that somebody else was giving me, so I couldn't cherry pick. It's like, oh crap, I have to write about that. Okay, here I go.
Yeah, I think it's rapid improvement, and potentially also it'd be interesting in your actual, because you talk about it now quite pleasurably in the sense that, it dramatically transformed your creative output. But there's the potential at the time that it's painful, that you just think, oh, no, don't make me do that. I don't want to do that task. But if we take it back to, let's use an analogy like repetitive strain injury, for example. That happens because people do the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and don't get any relief from it. And most of us now know that, one of the writer problems of sitting at a desk for hours at an end is really not terribly healthy. You definitely need to get up and move around. People have other habits, gym habits, Alida's an adventure junkie. You've got these sort of things that hopefully, give us variety. And what do they say? Variety is the spice of life. And it's the same as going to the gym or going to other exercise classes. If you only focus on one type of activity, then those are the muscles you'll strengthen. And those are the bones that will get the weight bearing. But smart exercise, physical coaches, whatever type of thing you do, yoga, Pilates, they know that it's about variety of movement. And I think we can take that into the creative world, that the practice is best done if you've got a variety of things to practice with. And it may not be the constraints that we've just been talking about. It might be different constraints. It might be saying, okay, I'm going to go for a change and go to a coffee shop and I'm going to handwrite as opposed to sit in front of my computer and try and type things out. Or this time I'm going to force myself to do 5 bullet points before I start. Just something that gives that breaks the mold of the repetitive strain index of always always thinking the same way.
Right. And, we don't want to cause any of our readers repetitive story injury.
Oh, my God. No.
I'm on tonight.
You had to go there.
I did. You set it up, Robert. It was just too easy.
Yes.
Something we can do is just give ourselves a writing prompt every day, a daily writing prompt. So you sit down and you set your timer for 15 or 20 minutes, and that warms you up. And then when you do re-enter your story, your novel, and you go back into that voice and that world, maybe because you did something different first, you'll get a little surprise. Maybe it opens the door within the main project to do something fresh. When you were talking, Robert, something else that occurred to me is we have to put stuff into practice. So if people listen to our podcast, to all 200 and, whatever, 48 episodes or something, you're going to put a lot of information into your head, and that's great. But if you say, oh yeah, I learned this about character, wonderful, but then you don't go sit down and try to do something with that information, where's it going? What good is it going to do you? That's why such an effective teaching model is hear it, see it, do it. So if you're only hearing this, whether you see it in print or not somewhere or notice it, if you aren't doing it, if you aren't playing with the practice of it, then how much can it benefit you?
I think it can be incredibly frustrating as well, doing lots of learning about the craft and getting these great insights, even to the degree where you can read great works and understand what they're doing. And then you come to, if you haven't practiced and you come to writing it yourself, the turgid rubbish that comes out. I can remember learning archery, which is I didn't continue. I would like to have continued it more, but we get the instructor obviously doing the safety stuff, and then picking up here's the first kind of bow we're going to use. You're not going to go to one of these ones. You're going to go to one of these ones, and okay, all right, we're going to get the good stuff first, and then he does a few demos. Pulls the thing back, pretty much hits the target. 3 times over, you go, oh, excellent, all right, cool. And then you get there to the line yourself, and you can barely pull the thing back, and it's vibrating all over the place, and the arrow just goes disappearing off into the forest somewhere. And you go, okay, so there's more to this than it looks, huh? And I think art is whatever it is. It's whatever you put on the page, for sure. And if our goal is to intrigue our readers and make them want to read on, then we should always be looking for ways to improve that. And some of the things about constraints that can get difficult is if they do feel a bit painful, find another way into it. So maybe you've read a book recently where something that you love, like dialogue, for example, that interchange is just brilliant. Okay, well, let's pull it apart word by word. Why was it so brilliant? What was going on subtextually between the characters? Okay, now take that, your excitement about that, your joy, and write something similar, or just write the same thing with some slightly different words. Doesn't really matter. Find a way to get that framework working from brain to pen or to fingers. And I think that's what Alida's saying is, you've got to, hear it, watch it, do it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But, who's got time for all this anyway?
Well, listening to podcasts and reading books and such can become a form of procrastination. Yeah. So as great and helpful as those things are, if you don't turn it into practice at some point, then it ceases to be helpful. It starts to become a hindrance.
So listeners, switch off now, unsubscribe, leave.
No, Robert. Robert,
get your words down. Don't come back. Don't come back until you've written 3 novels. We don't want to.
Well, no, but here's the thing that I've listening to you guys. This is why I'm writing short stories right now, right? Because if I was to attempt to do let's do a novel every time on everything that I'm, you just can't do it and practice efficiently. And what I'm finding with myself right now is I'm really good at coming up with an idea, and I'm really good at let's continue the visual art metaphor, at line drawing. But when it comes to adding shadow or light or, like all these different nuances, like that's where I need the practice is in the details and in the revision. And
nice.
So like right now going through my short stories, I'm like, yeah, I can write the thing, no problem. But can I make it say what I want it to say or be as good as I want it to be? Like that's where I need the practice. And so if I was writing 150,000 word novel because, my fantasy worlds tend to, and all of a sudden I've got 150,000 words, I wouldn't have the ability to practice that in any sort of meaningful way. Right. And you guys were talking about like quick feedback loops and all of that. If I have 10,000 words I'm working with, it's so much easier to get some feedback and rewrite the thing or revise it heavily, or even just revise it for one thing. Let's go back and double check the character. Like, okay, and I can do it quickly, or I can say, oh, wow, we just talked about foreshadowing. I'm going to write a whole story where the whole thing I'm practicing is foreshadowing, right? And to be able to just hammer that down in a couple of, weeks for the first draft or whatnot, to be able to have something to work with. That's where I think the short story, or like you were talking about writing prompts, Alida, where you can really do something short, but practice the thing that you need to be practicing rather than just always first drafting, which is kind of the routine I got into with novels. Was I just got stuck because I'd write the first draft and then I wouldn't know how to progress from there.
If you're listening to this podcast, you are probably a writer, and you've maybe heard me talk about the StoryWorks reading series. It is the new branch in the StoryWorks family tree. It is a literary journal podcast. That's right, a hybrid, a literary journal for your ears, with a print anthology at the end of the year of the best of the podcast. I am open for submissions, and I want to see your best prose right now. I am taking both fiction and creative nonfiction. You can read the guidelines and submit your work at storyworkspodcast.com/submit. What are you waiting for? It's time to see your stories published and sit on the other side of this microphone from me. Have a conversation about your storycraft. Yes. Amen. And you can complete something, and you can also shift the voice, the style, the world, the characters from story to story. And so, it's easy if something isn't your favorite thing in the world to say, well, I'm only giving it 2 weeks of my time or a month of my time, and I'm learning something, so who cares? But if you get into a novel and a third of the way through, you start feeling frustrated and you hit a wall and you don't know where it's going, or you don't know how to fix it. My God.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I've had plenty of clients who hit the wall, and it's like, I don't know how to fix it. What do I do? And, when you're looking at something big, when you're looking at 90,000 words or more, it's so much more to fix. It's got so many more moving parts and so much more complexity. And it doesn't mean the fix for the novel is harder than the fix for the short story. What you need is the same skill set, but it's harder to see, and there are more interlocking parts. And so there's a bigger ripple effect because you have more pages and such. So by turning to stories and exercises, you can develop those skills and learn to identify what's working and what's not working with an easy investment.
Yeah, I think this comes down to chunk size. When I used to help trainers in the corporate world set up their training projects, one of the things that we tried to teach people is try to make everything you teach almost infallible. So in other words, you get the chunk size down to the level where the learner can't really do anything other than succeed, assuming you've got good feedback. Assuming that you're giving useful feedback and good instruction. So I think what Kathryn's trying to talk about there is, well, the chunk size is now much smaller and faster. So the feedback loop can be, by default, can be faster as well. And the other thing I think is important is which you said, Alida, which is practice with intent, because at the start of this episode, we really talked about so many things you could think, oh my goodness, this is a fire hose of stuff I've got to do. And there's no gotta about it. You pick something and practice with intent. And I think this is where a professional teacher, like Alida, for example, she's not just going to give, random writing prompts each week. There's going to be a progression that's about perhaps, this time we're talking about the emotional arc of the character, or this time we're talking about bringing settings to life, or this time we're talking about making active as opposed to passive descriptions. And I think if I go back to something that's been tough for me to learn, Kathryn, I'm sure will have more insights about this, but I'm an adult piano learner. And sometimes I have to practice the ridiculously tiniest thing, which is a transition across a bar from one note to another, and do it whilst trying to get tension out of my shoulders or get the right touch or the right, softness. And it's 2 notes, but they can make all the difference to how the piece flows. It's extraordinary, really, and so I've had to learn to practice with intent, even though the adult me says, I'm much better than this. I should be able to play this whole page. Why can't I play this whole page? Let me just play the whole page again, over and over and over, and I'll just practice that stupid mistake in, and it's frustrating. And then it's only when you come back and fix the little bit that everything else falls into place. And I think writing practice is a bit like that. Have you come across that, Kathryn, that sort of thing when you're teaching piano? Oh, okay. Common.
Well, and here's another thing, this is part of being an artist, right? And this is why I wanted to talk about this, is because it does cross over. And I think sometimes we forget that. And I play music all the time. And do I think about music and what I'm teaching in music as pertains to writing? I don't even think about it, but I'll tell people, section it down, play these 4 measures, play them 3 to 5 times, and then go on to the next one. And thinking about that in terms of writing, it's okay, section it down. Let's look at this scene. Let's go over it 3 to 5 times. Let's make, go for this, go for that. Okay, now let's add the emotion. Now let's add this. And it's true, right? You can do all of that in layers and in pieces so that when you get to the whole, it's all there. Right. And you don't just go top to tail, top to tail, top to tail every single time, because you'll never get the ending to sound like the beginning. Right. And so I think it's just interesting how all of these principles of learning, right, and of doing art, they cross genre, right? and yet it's so easy to forget about things that maybe you do in other areas of your life that can be so beneficial to writing.
Yes. And it's really important too that we keep an open, playful mind about this. In the class I taught on Tuesday, I was looking at a student's assignment. So they had to write a factual truth and then an emotional truth about the fact, and then a metaphor that conveys this emotion and this truth, right? And if students write to the end goal, okay, got my truth, got my emotion, got my metaphor. Yeah, it's a pretty good metaphor. I'm done. It's easy to move on. But if we are open and playful, then we look at the metaphor and say, or what if I riff on this? The metaphor was about mittens in the lost and found box, right? So what kind of words can I use? Are they mittens is it like mittens being, or we are the mittens? Can I use a personal pronoun instead of something more abstract? Should I make it a simile or a metaphor? Should I add some descriptors? In the tattered cardboard box, lost but not found, instead of using lost and found. And so in this workshop, by riffing on this metaphor, I started with some really banal versions of the sentence, but then you start saying, if I change the syntax, if I add some adjectives, if I do this, if I do that, and you go in multiple new places by being playful versus satisfied. And if we bring that attitude to our writing projects, then, in the revision, and we're like, yeah, okay, that's good, but can I play with it? Can I go elsewhere? And we're retraining the brain to start seeing these possibilities much more quickly by doing the play in our practice.
When I was learning to race motorcycles around road racetracks, I took some really spectacularly great courses. And one of the things that they taught us to do in one of the very early grades was that you had to ride the track and use every part of the track right out to the edges till you're almost in either the grass or the runoff areas and the gravel, so that you knew it inside out. So you could locate spots on the track, places that you could use later on as reference points. And when you then start to, and you don't do that fast particularly, you don't need to do it, at race speeds, you're doing it reasonably quickly. But it's unbelievable all of a sudden how wide a racetrack becomes when you do that. That when you're at speed, you never see what's open to you. And so what then happens is the body unconsciously reacts to, if you get a little bit offline and go, oh, I can't go there because that's not part of the track. But if you've been there in practice and no, I can get around there, actually, there's actually a lot more room there than my eyes will tell me when I'm going at that sort of speed. This is what the brilliant, world leaders in motorcycle racing can do. And that's why they can overtake people, for example, because they can ride around. They know the track better. They know where they can adapt their riding and take a different turning point. And this is what you're saying, Alida, about taking something and not just practicing the one thing, but then generalizing it out and, okay, what if I did it this way? What if I made it an angry voice? What if I made it a soft voice? What if I took all the adjectives out and tried to write it without? Those type of things that would be challenging and yet inspiring creatively. I think that's, definitely some worthwhile micro practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like you kept using the word play, right?
Yeah.
Because it's entertainment at the end of the day, right? So play with it and make it fun. That's like the most important part. And if you're not having fun writing your book, who's going to have fun reading it?
It's the biggest dampener, isn't it, on creative spirit? Yeah, I agree. But I'm serious. I've got to be serious. I'm a writer.
Who says we have to be serious? Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.